Jonathan India has had a hot start to spring training. How big of an impact can he make in 2025? We'll give you our thoughts next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson. You can catch my username here on the bottom on YouTube, or at least if you're watching on YouTube, at JohnnyJ_15. But if you are listening to the audio, you can always check it out at JOHNYJ_15. And as you know by now, you can catch us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, or on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit the follow button and subscribe. Today's show is brought to you by wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Get snackin and get crackin with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. And for those of you tuning in for the first time, of course, welcome in. But if you want to know a little bit more about me, I am based here in Kansas City. I work at Sports Radio 810 WHB, doing a variety of things over there. But when it comes to this podcast, when you click on this link, you know that you're going to be getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. And as for your Royals, they were drubbed by Milwaukee today, their second loss of spring training, now on a 2-game losing streak, if you're keeping track of that. But they were televised for the first time this year. If you had the FanDuel Sports Network app, just the same thing as Bally last year, you were able to catch it. But it was the Brewers broadcast, so you weren't hearing the likes of Ryan Lefebvre, Rex Hudler, or Jake Eisenberg. But still, you got a glimpse of watching the Royals on TV for the first time this year, which I imagine for you was a welcome change, as for the first 4 or 5 games, all you got was audio or following along on StatCast like I was. But today they fall 12-5 to Milwaukee Brewers. We're not recapping that game as we did yesterday with the Royals and Rockies. What I wanted to do was spend the first segment diving into the production that Jonathan India has provided for this lineup in spring training and what the expectation is for him going into 2025. The lineup construction that we saw today was Jonathan India at third base leading off. We know that no matter if he's at second, third, or left field this year, he's going to be leading off. Then you got Bobby Witt Jr. in the 2-hole, Vinny Pasquantino in the 3-hole. Then things got a little bit more worked around, I guess you could say, constructed differently. You had Michael Garcia hitting cleanup today. That's never going to happen at one point in 2025. Salvador Perez will be hitting there. And then you might be able to place a different couple guys in the 5-hole and the 6-hole. Probably Kyle Isbell rounding things out. But back up to the top here with Jonathan India. Like I said, no matter where he's positioned on the field, he's going to be hitting leadoff. And today, watching him on TV for the first time, I caught glimpses of him in batting practice when I was down in Surprise, saw a couple live BPs. He does know how to work the count. He does know how to make a pitcher work for an out. And that's something the Royals didn't have last year. We all know that, right? When we've done this podcast and we have covered this team, we have seen Michael Garcia hitting up there. We have seen Michael Massey hitting at the top of the order, Nick Loftin, Tommy Pham. None of those guys really worked the count. Michael Garcia could see a lot of pitches when he was going well. When he wasn't going well, he was attacking the first pitch, and oftentimes it was leading to an out. What I saw today was something I'm hoping to see throughout the year, which was he falls behind 0-2. And yes, it's spring training, and yes, it's Aaron Savale on the mound. It's not like he's facing one of the best in the game, like a Paul Skeens out there, or he's facing the new revamped Chris Sale, or he's going up against Tarek Skubal. But Aaron Savale is going to be helping out the Brewers at the big league level this year. So it's not like he was facing somebody who's just getting their feet wet in big league camp. But he falls behind 0-2. Then he fouls a couple of pitches down the left field line, out of play. And one mistake happens. And he rips it to the left field wall right over a leaping Sal Frelick, I believe it was. And that's how the game started. Bobby Witt Jr. later on, he walks in that at bat and he comes around to score. Jonathan India does on a ground out by Michael Garcia. But it was almost the control that he had in each and every one of these at-bats. And looking at StatCast over the last few games that he started in, he's had this similar approach where even if you jump ahead 0-2 to start the game or you get out in front of him 1-2, he finds a way to battle just for a few extra pitches with the idea that one of the next ones the pitcher throws is going to be a mistake and it's going to be left out over the middle. It's going to be in his wheelhouse and he's going to be able to punish it. As I've said before on this podcast, with Bobby Witt Jr. hitting behind him, he's going to have a really good opportunity to turn into career year. It may not happen, but I've got a few reasons as to why, if you haven't heard me say this before. When you have an MVP player hitting behind you, every pitcher understands the fact that the last thing you want to do is put the leadoff guy on, especially if that MVP hitter's in the 2-hole. You put that guy on, now you could put somebody in scoring position with an MVP-like player hitting right behind him. And today, that's what we saw. I mean, you're trying to attack Jonathan India, and if he keeps fouling pitches away or he's spitting on a couple of pitches, you might make that mistake if you're not careful. And he's got the ability to drive the ball, hit the ball hard to all fields. And we saw that when he was going well in Cincinnati. He just didn't have the protection behind him with a guy like Bobby Witt Jr. Yeah, Ellie De La Cruz was in that lineup. The Reds have had good hitters in the 2 and 3 hole before, but nobody like Bobby Witt Jr. Bobby Witt Jr. could win an MVP this year. And as I said, every pitcher knows that. Whereas last year, with Maikel Garcia hitting leadoff, it's no disrespect to him, but in the end, he's just not a leadoff hitter. He's not the type of leadoff hitter the Royals need with Bobby Witt Jr. hitting in the 2-hole. When those slumps happened, you weren't working the count. He began almost every single game, Bobby Witt Jr. I'm speaking of, with one out and nobody on. And that's something the Royals wanted to correct in the offseason. I believe they've done that. In another at-bat he had today, he saw 5 pitches and walked. And he didn't swing in a single one. And there were 3 pitches in that at-bat that were very hittable. They were close, borderline strikes. There was no challenge system, or at least the pitcher did not challenge. I think it was Aaron Ashby that was out on the mound for Milwaukee for his second go-around. He walks in that at-bat. He also, I believe, had a sac fly in his third at-bat and then struck out in his final AB. But he's hitting .444 in spring training. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean a lot just for the batting average and the OPS. What I've been impressed by is the overall approach. The approach that he has brought to this lineup is something the Royals have not had there in I don't even know how long. They've never really valued the true on-base guy at the top of the order. They had Whit Merrifield there. He was more of a put the ball in play type of hitter, was very successful at it for a handful of years, led the league in hits, could steal bases. The stolen base part is not really going to be a part of Jonathan India's game, but if you are working the count and you're getting on base through walks, if you are trying to see 5, 6, 7 pitches each at bat, you're going to do a lot of damage for the rest of the order. You may not be getting on base, and that's one of the things that I talked to Jonathan India about was even if I'm not getting on, I'm setting the table for the rest of the order. And that's important to point out here. He didn't say I'm setting the table for Bobby Witt Jr. behind me. He said I'm trying to set the table for everybody in the lineup. And that may be beginning the game with a 10-pitch ground out or maybe working a 6 to 7 pitch walk. Just get the pitcher sweating a little bit. And that, as I said, just hasn't been there for the Royals over the decade plus when you think about it. Even in the years where they went to the World Series and won it, Alcides Escobar was not an on-base guy. He liked to ambush you. Whit Merrifield liked to ambush you. Alex Gordon, still not much of an on-base guy. He had his years, that's for sure, and he didn't lead off as often as Alcides Escobar or Whit Merrifield did or Maikel Garcia did last year. There were some years where they put him at the top of the order because he was the Royals' best hitter. Their on-base guy was Billy Butler, and Billy Butler's not going to hit leadoff because he had no speed. Jonathan India does have a little bit of speed, but to bring this walk rate and to bring this approach into the lineup, it's going to benefit a lot of guys at the top of the order. And as I said, with Jonathan India getting the benefit of hitting ahead of Bobby Witt Jr., now those pitches down the middle and those 2-0 strikes are going to be more common than they were last year. The last thing a pitcher wants to do to begin a game is put the leadoff guy on for Bobby Witt Jr. You want to be aggressive. You want to attack that guy, but it's not going to be easy in attacking somebody like Jonathan India. If you can recall back to that series against Cincinnati that the Royals had, Jonathan India was a pain to get out for everybody that was facing him. Lorenzen made a start in that series. I want to say Michael Walker made a start in that series. Cole Reagans, I believe, had the other one, or it was Brady Singer. But all three of those guys struggled with him. And he began a couple of those games with a leadoff hit. He also had a lot of walks. He had a 4-walk game last year. And no, it's not everything. I'm not trying to speak in Moneyball phrases here, where a walk is as good as a hit by pitch is as good as a hit because you're getting on base. But to have that mentality at that spot in the order, and with a guy like Bobby Witt Jr. hitting behind you, that's going to benefit both those guys. And that could set the tone for a lot of games. Or if you find yourself in a scenario late in the game and you need to get somebody on, he's one of those guys you want up, where Bobby Witt Jr. was that guy last year. You know, Vinny Pasquantino and Salvador Perez were also great hitters and turned in a lot of production last year, but they were not table setters. They were there to drive in runs. Now you bring in somebody else who can get on base to be driven in by a Bobby Witt Jr., to be driven in by Vinny, to be driven in by Salvi, and hopefully a lot more guys. But, you know, whether he's at third, left, or second base, the three positions we expect him to play this year, he's not going anywhere else other than the leadoff position. He is there to start the game by working the count, getting on base more than, I would say, 95% of the lineup. The only other guy that should probably get on base more than him is Bobby Witt Jr. if he's going to put up an MVP-like season. So I've been impressed so far. The defense hasn't quite been there, but he's learning a lot of different positions. It's going to take some time. There's going to be some growing pains. But at the plate, for that approach and what he's looked like, nothing short of fantastic so far for Jonathan India. Okay, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, maybe the star of camp so far has been Nick Loftin, doing the most with every opportunity that he's been given. Let's talk about that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. For our second segment, we are going to be diving into one of the utility players for Kansas City and the odds they make the roster, because I know going into a Mailbag Friday, which again, if you've got any questions, leave them on the YouTube video below, or you can always send them to my Twitter handle at JohnnyJ_15. But Nick Loftin is one of these guys that a lot of fans, a lot of followers have been asking about because of his start to camp and where he may fit into the roster. It's no surprise that the Royals didn't go out there in free agency and add in somebody to replace Garrett Hampson, Adam Frazier. They believe a lot in a guy like Kevin Biggio, knowing a lot of different positions. They are banking on a bounce back for him, but he's still a minor league deal guy, and he's going to have to force his way onto the roster because a move will have to be made to the 40-man if Biggio's to make it. Nick Loftin's a different story. Nick Loftin is on the 40-man roster. He's familiar with the organization. He's now been in the big leagues for back-to-back years. He came up late in 2023 when the team was on pace for 106 losses. And last year he had his moments, but the production wasn't there. You hear me say production a lot in spring training because for a lot of these guys, it's all we have to go off of. We're not going to take numbers from last year. That was last year. For some of these guys, scratching and clawing to make the roster, all we have is spring training numbers. And Nick Loftin is the guy that's stealing the show numbers-wise. Another 2-hit game for him on Wednesday afternoon. He's hitting .714 with a 1.818 OPS. He's played around the diamond, second base, third base. He's got the ability to play the outfield. And I do wonder if the Royals are buying stock in what he's doing right now, even though it's spring training. As I brought up in one of my episodes earlier this week, with these guys trying to make the roster, you have to put stock into the numbers they're putting up, because if they don't, they're not making the roster, right? If Nick Loftin was hitting $140, he would not be on the inside or have the inside track to make the roster. I'm looking at, Drew Waters. I'm looking at Nick Prado, Nelson Velasquez. By the way, Prado and Velasquez, both are guys that are out of options. They have to perform or they will not be on maybe any roster in the Royals organization. They would have to clear waivers to come back to the minor league level, which I don't believe they would want to do. If they were to get DFA'd they're probably hoping they get picked up elsewhere where they wouldn't be blocked. But Nick Pratto, Nelson Velasquez, Drew Waters, Nick Loftin, Kevin Biggio, all of those guys are being put under a microscope in 2025 for spring training. And if they don't perform, they're not making the roster. If they do perform, there's still no guarantee that they make the roster. And Nick Loftin's making it damn hard for the Royals organization to tell him that he's not worth a 26-man roster spot. And fortunately for him, the holes left by Adam Frazier and Garrett Hampson give him a path to the big leagues. He wouldn't be making the roster to be a starter, but we saw how often Adam Frazier and Garrett Hampson were in the lineup in 2024. Adam Frazier got in there a lot when there was a righty on the mound, when Michael Massey was banged up, when he could play left field, right field, second base, third base, at times first base. You move around that much, you're going to get in the lineup more often than not. And for Nick Loftin and Kevin Biggio, guys that can move around, that bat really does have the benefit. It has a little bit of buffer of maybe not being as hot in the early portions of the season. If your defense is there and you can be a late-game defensive replacement, the Royals will find a spot for you. The Royals will absolutely make moves to make sure that happens. And when you don't have to go out there and spend a lot of money on a free agent like they did last year with Adam Frazier and Garrett Hampson, giving them big league deals, now you can go with a minor league deal guy in Biggio and an in-house option in Nick Loftin. And for Nick Loftin, don't get it twisted. This is not some journeyman that had to work his way up every single level, and it was such a grind. I look at somebody like Javier Vaz, who I spoke to down in Surprises I brought up earlier this week. He is somebody, though he told me he's not surprised that he's in big league camp so early in his career. He's a 15th rounder. You go to most 15th rounders in baseball, it's a grind to get to the big leagues. And Vaz hasn't made it yet. I still believe he has a chance to this year, not to break camp with the team, but he does a lot right, especially with being a super utility guy, to make the roster. Nick Loftin was a first rounder. Like, Nick Loftin should be viewed as somebody that can be a big league contributor, that can move the needle for you, not just some bench bat that can, come in during a blowout or start a Sunday getaway game. Like, Nick Loftin has talent, more so than just his defense, and last year it wasn't there. But we saw with the Royals that there was some trust for a point in time. He had a ridiculous walk rate in such a small sample size where I want to say it was around 15 to 16%. The reason I bring that up is they tried him at leadoff because of that reason. So there was some faith that, hey, if we get him going and the confidence is there, he might be our answer for one of those corner outfield spots, or he might be the answer for one of our infield spots for guys that aren't healthy. But last year you hit 189, 148 at bats. That's not going to give the organization a lot of confidence, even with a strong spring. But moving around, and if you hit 715 like he is right now, and you're hitting the ball hard, that's another part we have to factor in here. These aren't just infield singles and softly hit line drives and fly balls that get put up in the sun and the outfielder can't see it. He is striking the ball with authority, and that's something I'm going to be paying attention to. Because if you're going to take a bench spot for the Royals, I need to know, or at least as a fan, as a consumer, I need to know that the downside, the floor of what you can be as a player is still higher than some of these other guys' floors. Like, when I look at Nick Loftin, if he were to hit 180 or 190 again, he still has the defense. He still can move around. It's the same way I viewed Adam Frazier and Garrett Hampson last year. Even though the offense wasn't there. You had guys with MLB experience. Hampson had speed. Adam Frazier could move around. At least they had that, where if they were going to hit, 180, 190, 200, maybe slightly above 200, I can still count on the defense. And unfortunately, for some of the other guys that are not named Nick Loftin and Kevin Biggio, what's the floor for Nick Pratto? What's the floor for Nelson Velasquez? What's the floor for Drew Waters? I would even say that for Drew Waters, he does bring you some above-average defense in center field. For Nelson Velasquez, as high as I was on him last year, and loved what he did in 2023, the 14 homers in 40 games for the Royals. And Andy Rogers, by the way, did a great article on him saying he feels closer to 2023. His bat's a bit quicker. That's great to hear. And a lot of these guys are going to tell stories of that as to why they're in the best shape of their life or they feel like they've changed something. But for Nelson Velasquez and Nick Pratto, the defense isn't there. They're not good defenders. And Nick Pratto's playing a little bit of the outfield to carve a path for him to Kansas City. But at first base and in the outfield, it's not there. And at the plate, he's a guy that can strike out 40% of the time at the big league level with little to no power. Nelson Velasquez, we saw last year, bad defense, struck out a lot. And if the power was there, you can keep him on the roster for maybe longer than most teams would, but the power wasn't there. He hit 200 and didn't even reach 10 home runs last year. That becomes a problem when you're striking out that much and the defense isn't there. For Loftin and Biggio, if the offense isn't there and they're striking out 20 to 25% of the time, they are going to get a longer leash because they can play so many positions. And for the most part, they can play some of those positions very well. That's why at this point in time, I have both those guys on the roster come opening day, and that is going to slam the door on a couple other guys that are out of options. Okay, we're going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, if Carlos Hernandez is going to continue to struggle, who is going to take that last bullpen spot for the Royals? We'll dive into it next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. For our only sponsor today, we're going to give a shout out to Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts, where each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better-for-you unsaturated fats to help you keep you feeling fuller longer. Get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Again, that's wonderfulpistachios.com. The final segment will center around the bullpen today, and I have gotten some feedback on from YouTube and from Twitter on guys that are felt more strongly about, guys that people are ready to cut bait with. Carlos Hernandez's name has come up. Steven Cruz has come up in more of a positive light. Evan Sisk a few times has been mentioned. Noah Cameron, making room for him in the bullpen, even though for the most part he's a starter. Even somebody like an Eric Sarantola, who would have to really force the hand of the Royals organization to get up there, but he does have strikeout stuff. And that last bullpen spot is going to be a question mark for the Royals, I believe, for the majority of camp. Going into Surprise, my pick was Carlos Hernandez. He's out of options. He's got a triple-digit fastball. Thought he looked good at the very tail end of last year, but that first outing wasn't pretty at all. And that looked like a typical Carlos Hernandez outing when he implodes. The fastball is hittable despite the velocity. There's not much spin to it, I would say, where we talk about spin rates with fastballs. If he had a good spin rate, that 100 looks like 105 and might be unhittable. But it's not much spin to it. It's flat. It's hittable. It doesn't have too much run to it. We've seen Carlos Hernandez's stuff when it's working, when he's got the changeup working. He's got the curveball going. That was more so when he was a starter, but the fastball is his premier pitch. And what is concerning is if the fastball is getting crushed, you can't really set anything else up. You can't use that changeup. They're not going to swing at it. They're going to wait for that fastball because it's usually right in the middle of the zone. Now that he's found more of that command, when he misses, it could be in the middle of the zone. Whereas early on in his career, he was missing all over the place. And he did get some outs by being wildly effective. And that's a phrase I love to say with guys that, might have a 3.5 ERA, but they've got a 1.4, 1.5 whip. They are wildly effective. And I use that because Carlos Hernandez has been one of those guys where when the numbers, they look fine on the surface, but they're not really that good. And there are a lot of problems to that pitcher's game. And for Hernandez, he did bounce back in a strong way. He looked good in his second outing of spring training, had better command, velocity was still good, but he wasn't getting squared up in the way that he was in the first go-around. Then you have somebody like Chris Stratton, who punched out 2 in his outing. Looked like the Chris Stratton when he would go on certain stretches in the 2024 regular season. There was one point in time, I want to say he had 7 or 8 scoreless outings in a row. Curveball was really effective. That is his premier pitch, as I said, with Hernandez, it's the fastball. But he would always set it up well with his fastball. That would sit around 90 to 92. And that's when Chris Stratton is going at his best. He now is in that conversation. Because if Carlos Hernandez would have come out and in 3 outings dominated, looked like he did in late August and September, there wouldn't have been much discussion, in my opinion. Believe you would have cut ties with Chris Stratton. You would have given more seasoning to Noah Cameron for Eric Sarantola, though I don't believe Sarantola really had a chance. Noah Cameron could have been that possibility. Kyle Wright, he's not healthy right now. Alec Marsh, he's just now getting back into the swing of things, and it would become a 2-horse race. And what are you going to go with? The upside of Chris Stratton or the upside of Carlos Hernandez? I'm going with the upside of Carlos Hernandez. And there still is that belief that Hernandez catches fire here in spring training. If he stays healthy, he's going to get the nod over Chris Stratton, or he's going to get the nod over Evan Sisk. My issue with Evan Sisk has nothing to do with his stuff or how he'll fare in camp. It's that the Royals have 3 lefties in the bullpen. And with the elimination of the loogie in baseball, you don't need 4 lefties in the bullpen. They've got Sam Long, they've got Angel Serpa, and they've got Daniel Lynch. You don't need that 4th lefty, and a lefty who's never pitched in the big leagues before and still has struggles with his command. No, you're going to want a righty. That last spot is more so of a middle-of-the-game type arm. Not the highest of leverage situations, but we may need you to go in the 6th or 7th when it's a 1-run game. Not quite John Schreiber's role, but John Schreiber will be closer to that role now because Harvey, Ursig, and Estevez will have the final 3 innings of each game, hopefully. Those will be your 3 highest leverage guys. So you're almost looking for that guy who can just throw strikes and be the bridge gap and not run into too much trouble when he takes the mound every single night. You're not asking for Lucas Ursig stuff. You're not asking for John Schreiber in high leverage spots. You just need somebody who you barely even notice through that night. And if that's Carlos Hernandez, you get the benefit of that triple-digit fastball, the vicious stuff that he possesses, or do you go with Chris Stratton, who, yes, struggled with the command the majority of last season, but in his career never really has a great spin rate on the curveball, was fine for Texas in 2023, a playoff team, I might add, and the wheels fell off last year. And I do wonder if he was healthy, truly healthy, I would say, for the entirety of that season. Or were some of those, phantom IL stints because he was struggling, get fixed, get your mind right, stuff like that. With Hernandez, might have been the same thing as well. Making sure that he is 100%, not just physically, but mentally. He does have the advantage at this point in time because of that out of options thing, but there are other players, other pitchers in camp that are going to be out of options, and the Royals are going to make a decision on. But who are you more confident, I would say, would catch on somewhere else? If you let Carlos Hernandez go, what are the chances he catches on somewhere like Tampa Bay or with the Dodgers or Cleveland? That would be a nightmare scenario. I mean, you let a fireballer go like that, and you never were able to harness his power, and you were never able to figure out why it wouldn't work. I mean, I consider that to be false as well, because the Royals did figure it out with Carlos Hernandez for a point in time. It's just never been consistent. But in spring training, as I've said with Nick Loftin, as I've said with all those guys fighting for a spot, they don't have the benefit of the doubt. They can't, muddle around in camp and have a bad ERA and struggle with command, and the Royals go, well, it's just spring training, you'll figure it out. There's no guarantee that Carlos Hernandez or Chris Stratton figures it out. There are guys that are pounding on the door of Kansas City and deserve a spot in the bullpen and maybe one day deserve a spot in the rotation. If Alec Marsh was healthy to begin camp, or Kyle Wright was healthy, or James MacArthur was, there would be more heat on Carlos Hernandez. But Chris Stratton's another one of those guys that can give him a run for his money. And I'll tell you this, if Carlos Hernandez has a couple of blow-up innings, and it's ugly, then they're going to go with Chris Stratton if Chris Stratton really has things ironed out. If Chris Stratton appears in 8 or 9 games this spring and he has one earned run to his name and Carlos Hernandez has 8 or 9 outings and he's given up, 6 or 7, who do you think they're going to go with? They'll probably side with Chris Stratton if he looks that much better than Carlos Hernandez. And you roll the dice that he passes through waivers and you keep him in Omaha. I just would doubt that because somebody's going to look at that fastball, look at some of the secondary offerings he has, and say, we can make it work. The Royals tried it a few years back with Domingo Tapia, who was throwing 1,000,000 miles an hour for the Red Sox, and they tried it in Kansas City. It didn't work out. We see fireballers all the time get picked up off waivers, and it doesn't work. That's the risk you take. No, I know I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, and there's still plenty of outings to be had for Hernandez and Stratton and Sisk, and maybe if Alec Marsh can get going sooner rather than later, there's going to be those conversations as to who deserves that final bullpen spot, but it's not going to be an easy answer anymore, especially with the way that first outing looked for Hernandez. Chris Stratton looked a little bit better, but there's still 5, 6, 7 more games down the road that could be dictating that final spot in the bullpen. All right, that's going to do it for us. Another edition of Locked On Royals in the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second, find Locked On MLB as baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Tomorrow, it'll be another Mailbag Friday, but until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.